I'm Dr. Shandamik, your professor for this course, Research Methods. This is the third week in which we're reading some of the chapters and talking about your research methods and agenda for your research for this term. Put together a couple of slides here about research worldviews, and then also just a couple more comments on deductive versus inductive reasoning. And so let's see, how do I get to my next page, please? Okay, so here is this research worldviews shape research designs slide. The first in the top left corner is post-positivism. And this is a research worldview or perspective that looks to understand discrete phenomenon and posits that the truth is knowable and that can be illuminated by reductionist variables. So when you take an idea or a belief or something about a person and create a discrete variable capturing something about that person. And that's how you might get, for political beliefs, you might get conservative versus liberal. Even though we know that those two categories do not capture a lot of the complexity in how people think about the world. But they do tell us something, and they tell us enough for it to be useful to many studies. And so post-positivism relies on empirical observation and measurement, and this would be what we might consider the more classic political science, where you have large databases of measurements and observations, and then you can use statistical measures to test whether or not there's a correlation between variables, input variables and outcome variables. And then there's theory verification. Typically with this type of research design, you are trying to verify or even disprove a theory by collecting data that should find gaps, or your research might suggest gaps in that theory. Also, the second corner down here is advocacy and participatory. This type of worldview is when you want to potentially change public policy or public understanding of an issue by engaging in research that has a political interest at stake. Often it's empowerment issue oriented, so it might be something about do universities implement Title IX in a way that leads to satisfaction of outcomes by students. That might be one issue. And you could use your findings in order to push a policy agenda. It can also be collaborative, so you could do a research study with an understudied population, like say if you did a project about how the environmental services staff at the university feels about wages and labor conditions. You might work with that community in order to come up with research questions that would more reflect their understanding of the issues. And then, of course, you're not just outsourcing your research design to the collaborative, but you are cognizant that if you ask research questions that people either don't understand or don't seem important, that people will be less likely to be interested in what you're doing. It's also change-oriented. Constructivism is a worldview that suggests that how people experience phenomenon really depends on how they understand both their place in the world, as well as whether or not past institutions, laws, and other political processes have worked to their advantage. So what you're trying to do here is understand the perspectives of others in coming to understand a political phenomenon or law or policy. So you could do a study of something like No Child Left Behind and try to understand the perspective of teachers who are forced to spend time to teach to the test, so to speak, and see whether or not they agree that is a valid gauge for understanding how well their students are doing. A more post-positivist take would be to crunch data related to student outcomes and try to understand why there might be differences amongst different demographic groups. In this constructivism, you have multiple participant meanings, meaning that the meaning of a law or a policy is not fixed. It's not what Congress declared, but its meanings are derived from how it's implemented, who's gains from it, who loses from it, and how that law or policy might change their circumstances. You can also use social and historical construction. And that's something that the paper that I posted this week discussed in their qualitative section of their paper. They looked at how counties that were more likely to hold slaves than adjacent counties had constructed institutions and local policies that would maintain the dominance of the white society. And so that, in a way, is their analysis of why and how that happens is more of a social and historical construction. And also, constructivism can lead to theory generation. And so when you are, say, you're trying to understand why a particular policy failed, then when you immerse yourself in the policy process, you might understand points at which the intentions of Congress were either not informed or they were deliberately benefiting different classes of people differently. And so you might be able to generate a theory about policy failure that relied on your study's examination of what policy meanings exist for different types of people. And then in pragmatism, which I've used a lot in my research, since I study public policy and how policy is implemented on the ground, I've been interested in the consequences of actions when you tax people or when you require them to get a permit for hunting that they've done generationally, or when the United States enters into a treaty which requires domestic legislation. What are the consequences of those actions? It tends to be problem-centered, and another common question is, did this policy fit this particular problem? And some of my work has looked at whether or not policies related to natural resources fit the ecological dynamics as well as the social dynamics of a region. Pragmatism, it can be pluralistic. It can, involve multiple methods, as well as various ways to look at an issue. And then it's often real-world practice-oriented. And so if you have any questions about these worldviews and examples of them will show up on your exam. So you will want to be familiar with these. This second form or this second diagram is from a book about research methodology by Cresswell. And so you have on the left side the research approach, the knowledge claims, the strategy of inquiry, and then the methods. So, and this is what we've just been talking about, this knowledge claims, which are basically worldview, or how do we know what we know. The research approach is more the category of methods. And so here, many quantitative studies will have a post-positivist perspective, and a key strategy is experimental design, and methods include measuring attitudes or rating behaviors. And experimental means that you'll be collecting your own data or taking data from different databases and determining what your variables are that you think have a relationship. So qualitative studies oftentimes stem from constructivist assumptions, and a strategy to engage in that would be ethnographic design, where ethnography is where you immerse yourself in a research environment and draw insights, observations, and conclusions from those observations. And then your methods are often field observations. But your ethnographic design can also include surveys, can also include a method we call Q-sort, which we'll talk about later, which asks people to come up with words to describe the phenomenon they're experiencing. Like if we used a participatory scale, they might talk about how participatory is a certain political process they're involved in. So another qualitative approach could use emancipatory assumptions and a narrative design. And so in that case, you're really asking your research participants to help you construct a narrative of a phenomenon based on their perspectives. And often you use open-ended interviewing. And in this case, you're asking questions of them, but you're not, and that might be asking them to explain cause and effect, but you wouldn't necessarily be trying to then counter check those claims with other methods, though you might want to. And then a mixed method approach, often you would have pragmatic assumptions, and you'd use a variety of methods, including closed-ended measures and open-ended observations. So this is really, this row really could be a lot of things in here. I want to just go back just to make sure I was clear, but this design, emancipatory assumptions, really gives your research participants the power to describe the phenomenon, and you are being you're helping them craft that narrative and to make sense of it, but the data all comes from the participants. I think, and then I have a couple slides here that are really about steps in deductive quantitative analysis and qualitative inductive analysis. And so these really are kind of general points in terms of whether or not you go from gathering interviews to posing generalizations or theories, or you go from having a theory that you want to test or verify and then developing your questions from that theory. And I hope that's useful. I'll be posting another video hopefully later today, but it might be tomorrow, talking about chapters 5 and 7. Okay, hope you're having a good day. Bye.